Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
Can you guess what happened next? My graduation party turned into an engagement party, and 12 hours later my phone lit up with a fraud alert, which sounds like something pulled from a bad television script. But for me, it was the exact moment when I realized that the same family who taught me to clap politely while swallowing resentment would also force me to decide whether to protect my own future or keep quiet for the sake of appearances. The evening itself started normally enough, if you can call standing in a banquet room while distant relatives mispronounce your degree title normal, and I told myself over and over that even though Chloe had barely mentioned my years of work, I was still proud of myself because no one else had to understand the late nights of spreadsheets and tuition payments except me. Then, right as my aunt carried the cake forward, Chloe cleared her throat, stood up, and with that familiar smirk that has followed me since childhood, announced that she had something far more exciting than a diploma. Evan, her boyfriend, dropped to one knee, produced a box, and the room erupted in applause that felt like it belonged at someone else's event, not mine. I hugged her because cameras were pointed in our direction. I smiled because my parents were staring, and I told myself not to be petty, not to be small, but inside I heard a voice repeating the same question. Why does Chloe always get to rewrite the headline while I am expected to hand her the pen? After the last guests left, I loaded leftovers into plastic containers, thanked the caterer, and reminded myself to cash the graduation checks later, because at least that part was mine. When I got home, still smelling faintly of buttercream and exhaustion, my phone buzzed. It was a fraud alert from my bank. A new line of credit had been opened in my name, and a purchase had just been made at a jeweler across town, the kind of jeweler that advertises rings with zero-interest financing and giant billboards of perfect couples. At first, I assumed it was a mistake, maybe a system glitch, but the notification showed the amount, a figure high enough to make my stomach clench, and the timing was too sharp to ignore. Because the store had closed just a couple of hours before Evan got down on one knee. I opened my credit report, something I usually keep frozen unless I am applying for housing or loans, and sure enough there was a fresh inquiry from the financing company that partners with that jeweler. My brain replayed the last few months, printing my internship tax forms at my parents' house when my printer died, leaving the manila folder on the dining table while we ran out for pizza, and Evan cheerfully offering to clear the table before our board game started. I remembered brushing it off, thinking it was helpful. Now I felt the pieces rearranging into something uglier. Ring plus approval plus timing equaled someone sliding into my identity to secure their perfect proposal. I called the bank number from the alert, verified my identity twice, and asked them to lock the account. The representative asked if I recognized the purchase, and I said no, trying to keep my voice flat because part of me was already writing down steps like I was building a case file. Freeze the bureaus, file the report, document everything. Sleep did not come easily that night because every time I closed my eyes I saw Chloe's smug expression as she announced, "Guess it's my spotlight now," and I hated how satisfying it was to imagine that spotlight dimming if what I suspected turned out to be true. By morning, I had made coffee strong enough to burn and drove straight to the jeweler, asking politely if there was any record of a purchase under my name. The associate glanced nervously at the computer and said the manager would be back on Monday, which told me enough to confirm I was not imagining this. I noted the date, took a discreet photo of the storefront, and told myself again not to confront Chloe until I had proof, because if there is one lesson I have learned in both grad school and family politics, it is that feelings get dismissed, but documents hold weight. At brunch, I said nothing, just pushed eggs around my plate while my parents praised Evan for planning such a romantic surprise. I nodded and sipped orange juice that tasted sour, telling myself that silence now would buy me clarity later. On the drive home, I set up new passwords, refroze every bureau, and created a digital folder labeled simply Case. Inside, I placed screenshots of the fraud alert, copies of the inquiry, and a typed timeline of the party, the purchase, and my memory of that manila folder. I had not confronted anyone yet, but the question was already hammering in my chest, not whispered, not imagined, but fully formed and brutal in its simplicity. If Evan really did buy Chloe's engagement ring with my information, and if I could prove it beyond denial, then what would happen, not just to their relationship, not just to the family's version of joy, but to my place at the table that had never truly felt mine? When Monday arrived, I knew that treating this like some minor inconvenience or a quirky misunderstanding would be the exact mistake that Chloe and Evan were counting on, because if I acted casual, the whole thing would quietly slide into family gossip territory and then dissolve into another one of those stories where I come off as uptight, ungrateful, or overly dramatic. So instead, I took a personal day from work and mapped out each step like I was drafting a project plan, starting with contacting the 3 credit bureaus to extend the freeze, then calling the financing company whose name was printed on the inquiry, and finally heading over to the jeweler to see if the manager would admit what the sales associate had hinted at when I dropped by on Sunday. The manager was polite but brisk, confirming that yes, a purchase had been processed under my profile, though he reminded me that their legal department would have to release any details formally, which meant this had already moved past customer service territory and into official channels, and as he spoke I felt my chest tighten with a mix of anger and relief, because the confirmation was a wound but also proof. The kind of proof you can point to in a room full of relatives who would rather keep the peace than face the facts. From there I drove directly to the precinct, sat down with a detective named Marco Ruiz, and filed a report, which required me to recite the timeline in excruciating detail when I printed my tax forms, when I last saw the folder, the moment the fraud alert pinged my phone, and the exact hour of the proposal, and while I spoke I could see in his eyes that this was not his first case of family-connected financial crime, which in some strange way made me feel less alone, like maybe I was not overreacting, maybe this was exactly as serious as it felt. By the time I got home that afternoon, I had a folder on my desk that contained the federal identity theft affidavit, copies of my report, and a list of action items, but I also had a growing sense that if I tried to handle this quietly, Chloe and Evan would twist it into a narrative where I either gave consent or misunderstood the process, so I reached out to Professor Laura Grant, the compliance director who had once mentored me during grad school, and she called back almost immediately, telling me that I was doing the right thing, that the worst mistake in situations like this is to negotiate privately, and that the safest move would be to make a factual, controlled announcement before whispers and half-truths filled the vacuum. That night, I sat at my kitchen table drafting the words, keeping them dry and procedural, no accusations, no adjectives, just 3 short paragraphs that explained I had discovered a fraudulent credit account, that I had filed a police report, that my credit was frozen, and that anyone contacted for verification should cooperate with the investigator whose email I provided. It was not meant as drama, not meant as spectacle, but as a protective barrier around myself, a signal that I was not going to stay silent or handle this in whispers, and after staring at the draft for an hour, I scheduled it to send to my family's group email and posted a trimmed version on Facebook set to friends only. The fallout started almost immediately, faster than I expected, with my mother calling to say that I should have spoken privately first because extended family will misinterpret, followed by my father insisting that Evan had already explained everything and that apparently I had agreed to help with financing because my credit score was better, which was not only insulting but factually impossible since I keep my reports locked down precisely to avoid situations like this. And then Evan himself texted me with the gall to claim I was twisting the narrative and that he had proof, which I forwarded straight to Detective Ruiz and to Professor Grant without responding, because engaging on his terms would only drag me into a swamp of endless spin. I thought perhaps my silence would calm things down, but instead, a few hours later, my parents posted in the extended family group chat congratulating Chloe again, reminding everyone to focus on the joy, and slipping in a sentence that stung more than anything: Madison is working through a financial misunderstanding and has it under control, which might sound neutral to an outsider, but in my family was code for don't ask questions, don't take her seriously. And reading it felt like a punch to the chest because it showed me that when forced to choose between protecting their daughter and protecting the story, my parents chose the story. That night, I sat with a mug of tea that went cold in my hands, staring at the copies of my report spread out across the table, and I promised myself that no matter how loud the family group chat became, no matter how many relatives called me uptight, no matter how many excuses Chloe threw in my direction, I would not back down, because this was no longer about a ring or a party. It was about whether my own name meant anything when someone tried to sign it without me. The truth is, I wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, Chloe would call in tears, admit what Evan had done, and beg for help, but instead she stayed silent, leaving me with my parents' rebuke echoing in my head and the knowledge that I had a choice to make. Either soften, apologize, and let them rewrite this as another example of Madison being too rigid, or keep pushing forward, evidence in hand, and accept that I might fracture the family for good. And then the group chat notification lit up my phone with a new message from my father, the words sharp and final, "Madison, we expect you to apologize to Evan for casting doubt on his engagement." That was the moment I realized this was no longer just a legal matter, but a social battlefield where I stood entirely alone. And I sat there wondering not if I had the strength to fight, but how much more of myself I was willing to sacrifice in order to hold the line. When the call came from Detective Ruiz asking me to stop by the precinct because the jeweler and the financing company had already turned over their files, I knew before even leaving my apartment that whatever I was about to see would be the point of no return. And as much as I wanted to believe that maybe this was still a misunderstanding, some technical glitch or administrative error, the truth is that deep down I already knew I was walking into a confirmation that would change not only the way I looked at Evan, but also the way I would ever again be able to look at Chloe, because the moment you see undeniable evidence, you lose the luxury of pretending there is still room for doubt. The packet Ruiz laid out across the table looked like any other set of financing forms, the kind I had handled in business school case studies, neat lines of typed data with little boxes checked off and my name at the top. But the signature scrawled at the bottom was a forgery so sloppy that it made my stomach twist, because it was not even a good attempt at copying my handwriting, it was just a confident scribble. The kind of scribble made by someone who assumed no one would ever bother to look too closely. Ruiz paused a video still from the jeweler's security system, and there was Evan, dressed for the big night, leaning on the counter, signing the papers without hesitation, sliding the folder back, and carrying the box toward the door with a smile that made me feel both sick and oddly calm, because finally there was no debating whether I was imagining things or exaggerating a coincidence. When I left the station with a copy of the report and the investigator's assurance that the county attorney was already reviewing charges, I stopped at my mailbox and found a certified letter, which at first I assumed was another bank notification. But when I tore it open, I saw a welcome packet for a wedding loan in my name from a broker tied to Evan's own company, and holding that letter felt surreal, like being shoved into a courtroom drama I never auditioned for, except this was not entertainment. It was my real life, my real credit, my real signature reduced to something he could scribble at will. I took photos, scanned the documents, and emailed them directly to Ruiz, who replied within minutes with the kind of professional bluntness that reassured me more than any family member had. "Thank you. Keep everything. This is strong evidence." That night, when Chloe texted me a sprawling message filled with rationalizations about intent, about how Evan was going to pay it off right away, about how it was really just a shortcut and not theft, I felt a mixture of fury and sadness. Because instead of horror at what her fiancé had done, she was bargaining with semantics, trying to fold a felony into the category of family misunderstandings. I typed and deleted responses until I finally wrote, "Identity theft is a felony. I am cooperating with law enforcement," which should have been enough, but she shot back with a smug dismissal, insisting that I never even had a credit card, so I didn't understand how financing works, and here is where I made my one regrettable slip. The sentence that still irritates me because I know people will seize on it forever. I replied, "That's funny. I had a student card in college," which, if you remember, directly contradicted something I had told an aunt years ago when I claimed I never carried personal debt. It was a tiny inconsistency, the kind of detail most people would never think about twice, but in the heat of family conflict, when screenshots get passed around like trophies, suddenly that single line became ammunition, proof that Madison was inconsistent or exaggerating, and while the contradiction has nothing to do with the forged signature on that financing application, it was enough to muddy the waters in conversations that should have been straightforward. My father called later that evening, his voice calm in that way he uses when he is trying to persuade rather than argue, and he suggested that we all sit down at their house, just the family, no lawyers, no detectives, no outsiders, to talk this through like adults, but I knew exactly what that meant. It meant pressure, it meant manipulation, it meant them closing ranks to protect Chloe and Evan while framing me as the problem for refusing to play along, and so I told him, clearly and firmly, that if there was to be a meeting it would only happen with Detective Ruiz present, because an adult does not fix a crime with coffee and cake at the kitchen table. He did not like that answer. Silence followed, long and heavy, until I finally broke it by forwarding him the detective's official case number, because at this point the facts did not require my persuasion, they required acknowledgement. In the middle of all this, Professor Laura set up a call with a consumer rights attorney, and listening to him walk me through next steps, possible criminal charges for Evan, the option of a civil suit for damages. The reality of restitution and protective orders reminded me again that while my family wanted to frame this as some messy sibling spat, the law saw it clearly for what it was. He warned me that Evan might try to threaten me with defamation claims, but he said the best protection was exactly what I already had: evidence, dates, and restraint. No adjectives, no insults, no speculation, he told me, just documents and direct references. Let the paper speak louder than you. By Friday, Ruiz confirmed that the county attorney had indeed taken the case seriously and was preparing the next step. He asked if I had any texts from Evan requesting my personal information, and though I did not, I remembered that months earlier he had used my father's iPad to message me about the tax folder, which I had ignored at the time. That small memory opened the door to something larger, because my cousin Tyler, the one everyone jokes about as the family tech guy who never finishes anything, suddenly became relevant, and when I told him about the iPad, he grinned and said, "Give me the device and a weekend, and I'll see what's still buried in the backups." I ended the week exhausted but oddly steady, posting a short update on Facebook that simply read, "Fraud affidavit filed, police report filed, accounts secured. If contacted about a purchase in my name, please cooperate with Investigator Ruiz." Nothing flashy, no accusations, just a factual line that told anyone paying attention that I was not backing down, and though friends messaged me privately with sympathy, the silence from my immediate family was deafening. Still, the truth no longer needed my embellishment. The jeweler's video, the forged signature, the certified loan packet, all of it was enough to carry the weight without me saying another word. And then, just as I was closing my laptop for the night, Ruiz emailed me copies of the stills he had forwarded to the county attorney, the grainy image of Evan signing under my name, the financing packet with my information, the caption beneath it simple but devastating: "Buyer appears to be Evan Reed." That line, so concise, so unarguable, was the revelation that finally made everything undeniable, and in that moment I knew the story had a name, a face, and consequences that even Chloe would not be able to spin away. By the time the next week rolled around, I had already accepted that this entire situation had left the realm of family tension and entered the public sphere, not because I wanted it there, but because once evidence exists in police files and once relatives start whispering to one another through text chains and half-truths, there is no pulling it back into silence. And I began to notice that people were not only picking sides, but also rewriting the story according to whichever version made them feel least uncomfortable. Evan, predictably, leaned into his charm and started to paint himself as a man caught in a misunderstanding, the kind of guy who had simply taken a shortcut to make a romantic gesture. And he posted a carefully worded paragraph on Facebook about how he and I had agreed that he would use my credit just temporarily and pay it off immediately, attaching a screenshot that supposedly showed me offering to front the approval for the account. But even at first glance, the screenshot looked doctored, the fonts misaligned, the timestamps inconsistent, and while anyone familiar with technology could see the flaws, I also knew that family gossip does not require accuracy to spread, it only requires plausibility. I drafted a furious response, one that detailed the inconsistencies in the image and reminded everyone that falsified texts do not erase a forged signature on a financing document. But before hitting post, I sent it to Professor Grant. And she called me almost immediately to say, "Do not take the bait, do not get into a screenshot war, because truth does not survive when you start fighting on a stage that rewards drama rather than documentation." She reminded me that the real battle was already in the hands of the county attorney and that adding my emotions online would only give Evan new ways to twist my words, so I deleted the draft, closed my laptop, and sat staring at the ceiling. Furious that restraint often looks like weakness when, in fact, it requires more strength than shouting. Later that day, though, something happened that shifted the ground beneath me in a way I could not have predicted. The director who was set to be my new boss at the bank called me directly, saying he had seen my factual Facebook post and wanted me to know that their legal team fully supported the way I had handled it, that they respected my decision to remain neutral in tone and evidence-driven, and that my position with them was not only secure but strengthened by the way I had demonstrated judgment under pressure. I cannot explain how much that call steadied me, because while my own parents were treating me as if I had embarrassed the family, an employer I had not even started with yet was telling me I had done exactly the right thing. It was the first time in weeks that I felt like an adult recognized as competent rather than a daughter scolded for making waves. Meanwhile, Tyler, the cousin most people in the family dismissed as a half-serious tinkerer with gadgets and too many unfinished projects, had been working quietly with my father's old iPad, and when he asked me to come by his apartment, I expected nothing more than a vague lead or a hunch, but what he pulled up on his laptop was a screen recording of a recovered iMessage backup that stopped me cold. The thread showed Evan messaging from my father's account, asking about my social security number under the pretense that the wedding venue required it for a booking, and when I had not responded, he had followed up with another message. Found her tax folder at the house, we're all set, the timestamp matching perfectly with the night I had printed my documents and left them on the table. Tyler exported the recording, complete with metadata, and emailed it to Detective Ruiz, who confirmed within hours that it corroborated the financing packet. The impact of that discovery cannot be overstated, because while doctored screenshots on Facebook might confuse relatives, the combination of metadata-backed backups and the jeweler's video created a chain of evidence that lawyers could not dismiss as coincidence. For the first time since the fraud alert appeared on my phone, I felt like I was no longer the only one holding the weight of proof, because now Tyler, the cousin no one expected to matter in this story, had effectively dismantled Evan's defense with a single recovered message. When Chloe texted me that night, asking whether I would consider dropping the case if Evan simply paid off the account, I responded with a line that made her go silent. This is not a balance problem. This is a crime problem. My mother, trying once more to smooth things over, suggested that maybe we could all see a family counselor, maybe even talk to a pastor about forgiveness. But I told her as calmly as I could that forgiveness without accountability is just permission for repetition, and I was not willing to make that trade. Evan, not one to give up on manipulation, sent me a final text threatening to sue me for defamation, but the consumer rights attorney that Professor Grant had introduced me to replied on my behalf with a short, clinical statement. My client's statements are factual and supported by law enforcement case number X. Any further concerns should be directed to counsel. That kind of language, stripped of emotion and backed by authority, is the only thing bullies understand, and the silence that followed from Evan told me he had finally grasped that the ground beneath him was no longer tiltable in his favor. By Thursday, the county attorney filed a motion for a preliminary hearing, and for a brief moment, Evan tried to flip the script again by claiming in paperwork that I had authorized the account. But just as quickly Tyler's export of the recovered messages landed in the prosecutor's inbox with intact metadata, and I could almost hear the momentum shift back as cleanly and forcefully as if a switch had been flipped. It struck me then how ironic it was that the cousin who had always been underestimated, the one teased at holidays for fixing phones in exchange for gas money, turned out to be the decisive figure in protecting me. And maybe that was the lesson buried in all this chaos, that people who are dismissed as insignificant often carry the skills, the patience, or the perspective that ends up saving the day when those with supposed power falter. And so, even as my parents continued to issue vague statements about focusing on the joy, and even as Chloe sat silently defending the man she thought would elevate her, I knew that the truth had finally stabilized, that the weight of proof no longer rested on my shoulders alone, and that the courtroom waiting in the next week would not be a coin flip of he said, she said, but a reckoning anchored in evidence. Walking into the county courthouse on the day of the preliminary hearing, I felt a kind of heavy steadiness settle over me, the kind you get when you realize there are no more hypothetical outcomes left. No more back-and-forth arguments at the family table, no more frantic texts or manipulated screenshots, because the process has moved past whispers and into a place where only evidence counts. And while part of me wished that none of this had ever left the confines of that first fraud alert on my phone, another part of me recognized that once Evan decided to sign my name for something as consequential as an engagement ring, the chain of events leading here was inevitable. The courtroom itself was smaller than the television dramas make it seem, the air less theatrical and more procedural, with the judge flipping calmly through files while lawyers on each side whispered over their notes. And in that quiet formality I felt both exposed and protected, because here no one could drown me out with family chatter or sentimental appeals. The county attorney laid out the evidence with the precision of someone who knows that paper trails do not lie. The financing packet with my full name and partial social security number, the jeweler's video showing Evan confidently signing the purchase contract, the certified loan packet that had arrived in my mailbox like an unwelcome guest, and finally, Tyler's recovered iMessage thread that tied the entire sequence together with undeniable timestamps. Evan's attorney tried, predictably, to argue that this had been a misunderstanding, that Evan had intended to pay the balance quickly, that there was no malicious intent, but intent is not what defines identity theft. And when the prosecutor calmly stated that forgery, fraud, and unauthorized use are crimes regardless of repayment plans, I watched the color drain from Evan's face, and for the first time since this all began, I realized he understood there was no spin that could save him now. During a brief recess, I overheard the attorneys negotiating, and when the session resumed, the plea offer was clear. Evan would admit guilt to the charge of identity theft, accept probation, agree to restitution payments that would cover the fraudulent account and additional damages, and complete a financial crimes education program. It was not the dramatic moment of public humiliation some people might have imagined for me, but rather a sober resolution that protected my credit and set a formal record of what had been done, and strangely enough, I found that I preferred it this way, because real justice is not about spectacle, it is about certainty, about being able to carry on with your life without a constant shadow of doubt. When the gavel came down and the judge confirmed the plea, I felt relief more than triumph. Relief that the paperwork, which had once felt like a mountain crushing me, was now the very thing that had secured the truth. Yet, even in that moment of validation, a different kind of loss came into focus, because as I stepped into the hallway, there was Chloe, standing with her arms crossed, eyes full of betrayal, tears threatening to spill but tempered with anger. And when she finally spoke, her words landed like stones. "You ruined everything." I held her gaze and answered with a calmness I did not expect from myself. No, Evan's choices ruined everything. I just refused to carry his lie. She looked back and forth between us, her world collapsing not because I had exposed it, but because she had chosen to tie her identity to someone who built his proposal on stolen ground. And though part of me longed for her to break free of him and come back to me, I also knew that some lessons cannot be borrowed. They must be lived through, even if they shatter the person learning them. That afternoon, after returning home and sitting at the same kitchen table where I had once typed the first draft of my announcement, I composed a different kind of message, one that would belong entirely to me rather than being a reaction to someone else's choices. I announced that I had established a small fund to provide 2 years of credit monitoring for local high school graduates, administered through a nonprofit partner and named after my grandmother, the woman who had once taught me to practice my signature until it was second nature, reminding me that names carry power and must be protected. I used the initial restitution payment to seed the fund, supplemented by my own savings, and when I posted the announcement publicly, I did not frame it as revenge or vindication, but as an act of turning what had been an attempt to steal my identity into an opportunity to safeguard others from the same violation. Responses began to roll in quickly, some from colleagues and friends who called the idea brilliant, others from extended family who still could not resist making the story about embarrassment or airing dirty laundry. But I noticed that for every passive-aggressive comment there were 3 messages of support, and among them was a screenshot from Tyler showing that he had donated a small sum from his own side gig to the fund, attaching only 3 words: "Family protects family." That small gesture meant more to me than all the congratulatory posts combined, because it was proof that the cousin dismissed for years as unserious had understood the heart of the matter better than most adults in the room. My parents called that evening. My mother's voice softened as she admitted she regretted how quickly she had minimized my announcement in the family chat, while my father tried once again to convince me that perhaps I could have handled this quietly, without creating waves, without drawing attention, without establishing a fund that might remind everyone of what had happened. I listened, I nodded, but I did not agree, because I knew that silence would not have protected me, and silence certainly would not protect the graduates who would now have at least one layer of defense against the kind of violation I endured. As for Chloe, the silence from her end was total: no calls, no texts, no acknowledgement of the fund or of Evan's plea, and though part of me feared that our relationship was broken beyond repair, another part recognized that boundaries are not walls, but necessary markers of self-respect, and if she ever does reach out with honesty rather than blame, I will have to decide in that moment whether reconciliation is worth the risk of reopening wounds. For now, I live with the unanswered question, because not every story ends with closure, and maybe the truest form of power is being able to carry on even when apologies never come. Looking back, the arc of these weeks taught me something I did not expect. Justice is not glamorous, it is not loud, it is not about shaming the wrongdoer into submission, but about quietly reclaiming your own name, your own identity, your own narrative, and refusing to surrender them no matter how many relatives beg you to prioritize peace over truth. So when people ask me if I felt vindicated, I tell them the truth. I did not feel vindicated, I felt steady, and sometimes steady is stronger than any spotlight could ever be. And as for Chloe, if the day ever comes when she calls and says the words I have longed to hear, "I knew, and I am sorry," the real question will not be whether she means it, but whether I will be willing to let her back in after I finally learned how to breathe without her approval.